Okay, so the other day someone finally asked me the simple question, do I or do I not believe in God? So I said we're going to have a long conversation about this, because first of all we have to define what we mean by this term God. Do we mean a supernatural being? If that's the case, then the answer is simple. No. Well, wait a minute. Maybe it's not so simple after all, because of course I'm a Kleinian. And I'm also a Freudian. I'm a Kleinian Freudian. Both Freud and Klein distinguish two fundamentally different levels of the mind. For Freud, secondary process, rational, logical thinking versus primary process, non-logical thought. Same for Klein. Depressive position, relatively rational thought versus the paranoid schizoid position, where magical thinking prevails, omnipotence. These are layers of the mind. These are not stages. So in Freudian thought, one never gets rid of primary process thought. It's overlaid by secondary process thinking. In non-psychotic people, secondary process thinking, logical thinking predominates over primary process. For Klein, in non-psychotic people, depressive position functioning with its reality testing, its surrender of omnipotence and magical thinking predominates over the paranoid schizoid position, where omnipotence and magical thinking continues to operate. So we never transcend primary process entirely. We never transcend paranoid schizoid functioning entirely. The mind is inevitably an oscillation between these positions, and of course we wouldn't want to transcend primary process. As Hans Lowald has pointed out, there is such a thing as adaptive regression into primary process thought, when secondary process thinking becomes too remote from the unconscious, too dry, too abstract, too dispassionate. Creativity often involves dipping into primary process thought. Similarly, in the Kleinian model, we wouldn't want to entirely substitute depressive position functioning for paranoid schizoid functioning. There's a lot of good stuff in paranoid schizoid functioning. Falling in love. Decisive political commitment. There is such a thing as adaptive splitting. Splitting certainly operates in the paranoid schizoid position, but if we couldn't split, we would not have been able to shoot Nazis. We would not have been able to effectively fight and defeat Hitler. So passion belongs in the paranoid schizoid position, decisiveness, commitment, and we can't do without these things. So we would in no way want to entirely displace primary process and paranoid schizoid functioning by secondary process and depressive position functioning. Okay, having said that, supernatural God, the magical aspects of religion reside in the primary process, reside in the paranoid schizoid position. The omnipotence of paranoid schizoid functioning gets projected onto an omnipotent magical God. So I have to revise my answer. Obviously, on some level, I do believe in a supernatural God. I do believe in omnipotence. When I'm operating in the paranoid schizoid position, I try not to be operating there very often. In my dreams, I'm operating there. Every once in a while, I regress and I operate in the paranoid schizoid position. Occasionally, primary process predominates. So, I'm not a regular church attender, but if I get the cancer diagnosis, I'll be on my knees, I'll be lighting candles, I'll be saying prayers. In other words, the existential anxiety, the death anxiety stimulated in me by the cancer diagnosis is going to lead me to regress from secondary process and depressive position functioning into the primary process, and I'm going to be into magical thinking once again. So I can't simply say that I don't believe in God. A part of me believes in God. A part of me believes in magic. I don't like this part of me. I don't respect this part of me particularly, although I have to qualify that statement. When I became a father, I was filled with anxiety. How am I going to father this child? I went back to church. I needed to hang out with fathers. Yeah, they wore dresses, but so what? I still needed to hang out with fathers. And it helped me. It helped me become a father. When my anxiety subsided, I returned to secondary process, depressive position functioning. I stopped going to church, except at Christmas and at Easter, when I choose to re-enter that space in a way that I think more as transitional rather than either PS or D. I enter a transitional space where I'm really not asking, is this real or is this invented? Is this imaginary or is this real? I enter the transitional area where I beg that question. But most of the time I try to live in D. I try to live in secondary process, the realm of secondary process thought. And when I'm there, I certainly do not believe in God, a supernatural God. Okay. But does the word God always imply a supernatural God? Apparently, for some people, not. Take, for example, Paul Tillich. He says, God is my ultimate concern. So if my ultimate concern is money, I'm worshiping the God of money. From a Judeo-Christian point of view, this is a false God. This is idolatry. But nevertheless, for me, the idolater, money is my God. And that pretty much is the God probably for most people in advanced consumer capitalism, if you want to use God in that way, ultimate concern. For someone else, truth may be their ultimate concern, in which case their God is truth. For someone else, love is their ultimate concern, and for them, God is love. You can find that in the New Testament. Certainly St. Paul says that. Well, if God is love, then I believe in God, because I do believe in love. And it is my ultimate concern, along with truth. Truth is my other ultimate concern. So that means I do believe in God if we define God as truth and love. We may as well throw beauty in there as well. the true, the good, and the beautiful. If that's what we mean by God, then of course I believe in God. Do I believe in a supernatural God? No, when I'm functioning in D and I've got secondary process thought predominating, but from time to time I'm functioning in PS and primary process thought predominates, in which case I do believe in a supernatural God. If God is love and truth, then even when I'm in D, even when I'm operating with secondary process thought, I believe in God, if what we mean by God is love and truth. Some people mean by God a belief in a universal ethic, a universal moral ethic. If that's what you mean by God, then I believe in God. I don't believe that morality is entirely a social construction. I believe that there is a universal basis for conscience. I think everywhere in the world, children know what this is. Just listen to them. They say, "No, you had your turn. Now it's my turn." This is the ethic of reciprocity. It's the ethic of simple fairness. It's an ethic of equality. This rule applies to everyone. We take turns. That's fair. Fairness. Justice. This is universal. Now, particular societies build on this, elaborate on this, bend it in this direction, in that direction, but this core ethical principle is universal. So yes, I believe in a universal ethic. If that's what we mean by God, the idea that morality is not entirely a human social construction, but that there is something intrinsic in human nature and in the human situation that gives us this universal ethic. If that's what we mean by God, then certainly I believe in God, but I don't regard that idea of a universal ethic as in any way involving anything supernatural or magical. I think that pretty much covers my position on the matter. In the face of this universal ethic, this universal sense of responsibility, this universal sense of obligation, I submit. I sacrifice my autonomy in the face of this principle. I don't make this up. Human beings didn't decide to construct this universal ethic. If we go against it, we suffer. I have learned that, so I try to live in accordance with this principle. That is, I sacrifice my self-will in favor of my fundamental sense of responsibility. Does that make me a religious man? I don't think so, because I define religion as about the supernatural, whereas I find this ethic grounded in nature, in human nature, the nature of the human situation. So I see nothing supernatural about this, and therefore I see nothing religious about this. On the other hand, this does require me to transcend my narcissism, my egoistic will. I have to submit. On those rare occasions when I do go to church, I get down on my knees, and to my mind, at least on the level of D, who knows what's going on the level of PS, but on the level of D, I'm kneeling not to a supernatural God, but I'm kneeling to something beyond my narcissism, something other than me, to which I owe my existence. I did not father myself. I don't subscribe to what Norman O'Brown called the causa sui project. I am the cause of myself. No. I had a father. I had a mother. I owe my existence to them, and I owe my existence to a whole evolutionary process that put human beings here in the first place, and I owe my existence to being, whatever that is. I don't feel the need to spell it with a capital B such that it resonates with supernatural concepts of God. But I certainly did not create myself. I am not making my blood flow. I am not making my heart beat. There is something going on in me of which I am not the author. My going on being is not something that I'm managing. So I owe my existence to processes beyond my ego. Does that make me a religious man? If you define religion as magic and the supernatural, then no. If, according to Barthelme's definition of religion as essentially involving the supernatural and magical thinking, it need not be theistic, it need not posit a god or gods, but to qualify as religion, the belief system must posit supernatural elements, magical thinking, spirit entities, and so on. By that definition of religion, I agree with Freud, who in 1927, in The Future of an Illusion, considered religion illusion, and 3 years later, in Civilization and Its Discontents, he considered religion to be delusion. Freud does not explain this switch in his thinking about religion from calling it an illusion in 1927 to calling it a delusion in 1930. He defines illusion as a belief that cannot be either validated nor invalidated, a belief that cannot be known to be true, nor can it be disproved and known to be false, but one believes it anyway. An illusion cannot be either proved nor disproved, but you adhere to this belief because of your desire that it be true. He contrasts this with delusion, which involves holding a belief that is known to be false. One believes it anyway, despite the fact that it is known to be false. Okay, this shift in his thinking is really a shift from agnosticism to atheism. In calling religion an illusion, he's taking the agnostic position. He's saying religion cannot be known to be true or false, that the existence of God cannot either be proved nor can it be disproved. And this is correct. From any kind of rational point of view, agnosticism is the only valid position. In calling 3 years later, in calling religion delusion, Freud puts himself in an impossible position, because by calling religion delusion, he's saying that belief in the existence of God is belief in something known to not exist. Delusion implies belief in something false. Belief in the existence of God, then, would amount to believing something known to be false. Belief in God's existence would be false, would be an impossible position if it could be known that God does not exist. But the truth is, we cannot know that God does not exist. To insist that God does not exist is an irrational position. On the theoretical level, the only rational position is agnosticism, the admission that we cannot know. So Freud has moved from a rational to an irrational position. Why does he take this theoretical atheist position, insisting God does not exist, when 3 years later, 3 years earlier, he knew perfectly well that the non-existence of God cannot be proven, which is why he was agnostic back then. Why has he switched to this irrational assertion that God does not exist? He doesn't explain. Okay, but we need to make the distinction between theoretical atheism and practical atheism. While it's true that the only defensible position on the theoretical level is agnosticism, one can be a theoretical agnostic and yet at the same time be a practical atheist. The practical atheist says, okay, I acknowledge that I cannot know that God does not exist, but I'm going to live my life on the basis that he does not until I see some compelling evidence that he does. So I remain a theoretical agnostic, but I'm a practical atheist. I live my life on the assumption God does not exist until I find compelling evidence indicating that he does, and speaking personally, I have never encountered such evidence. So I'm a theoretical agnostic and a practical atheist. So God, for me, on the theoretical level, is an illusion. On the practical level, I feel no need for this hypothesis of the existence of a God. Now, there's no doubt that there are a lot of people who consider themselves religious, who, from my point of view and from Freud's point of view, are really not religious, only pretending to be religious. I'm talking about all of those people who, following Rudolf Bultmann's demythologizing approach to the New Testament, following Northrop Frye's view of the Bible as poetry and wisdom and metaphor, who take all of this not literally but metaphorically, and yet at the same time somehow convince themselves that this metaphorical reading of religious texts somehow makes them religious. I mean, I deceived myself this way for many years. I didn't take any of it literally. I rejected any form of magical thinking, at least when I was operating in the mature depressive position. I translated constantly. I had this translation device operating. Everything that was being presented to me as literal, I was immediately making metaphorical, assuming that a lot of other people around me were doing the same thing. Whether they were or not is hard to say. I think many of the priests were taking it all metaphorically rather than literally. And I had convinced myself that this made me religious. But I was haunted by certain passages from Freud, like this one, Future of an Illusion. He says, in reality, these are only attempts at pretending to oneself or to other people that one is still firmly attached to religion when one has long since cut oneself loose from it. Where questions of religion are concerned, people are guilty of every possible sort of dishonesty and intellectual misdemeanor. Philosophers stretch the meaning of words until they retain scarcely anything of their original sense. They give the name of, quotes, God to some vague abstraction which they have created for themselves. Having done so, they can pose before all the world as deists, as believers in God. And they can even boast that they have recognized a higher, purer concept of God, notwithstanding that their God is now nothing more than an insubstantial shadow and no longer the mighty personality of religious doctrines, unquote. So here Freud is echoing Blaise Pascal, whose famous statement is not the God of the philosophers, but the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Freud goes on to scold the demythologizers, saying they should not take the name of their God in vain. So the demythologizers, to the extent that they consider themselves religious, are self-deluded. This isn't religion. This may well be philosophy. It may well be a type of Christian philosophy, but it is not religion. These people are atheists and should admit to being atheists. If, on the other hand, they are taking it literally, then they're psychotic. But then so are we all psychotic to some degree. But there's a pretty big difference between people who try to resist being psychotic or to confine their psychosis to certain safe zones, who try not to indulge it, who do their best to transcend it. Big difference between folks who fight the psychotic in themselves and those who feel free to indulge it. But it's also my view as a psychoanalyst that no one is entirely sane. We all contain a psychotic area, and this is the area Melanie Klein called the paranoid schizoid position. A position, not a stage, a layer, a position that remains active throughout our lives in all of us. This is a psychotic area that remains active in all of us. I'm not trying to argue that this primitive part of me that is inclined to magical thinking, I'm not trying to rationalize it or justify it as anything other than it is: primitive, regressive, and psychotic. I'm just trying to acknowledge that this is a part of me. I think it's a part of everyone. This in no way suggests we ought to indulge it. On the other hand, we do have to acknowledge that it bears well, it operates in the same area as a lot of things that we regard as good and essential, like the process of falling in love, for example. Freud considered the state of falling in love as a kind of madness. I think it's widely recognized that we sometimes are madly in love, and that this state is akin to madness. It's a bit psychotic, but would you want a life without it? It's a bit psychotic to split and divide the world into all good on the one hand and all bad on the other. That's psychotic, because that's just not reality. The reality is continua, complemental series, mixtures, blends, alloys. Sanity involves living in this middle zone where things are much more complicated than all good and all bad, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. But we need to split. We need to be able to distinguish predators from friends, poison berries from edible berries. Sometimes we need to be able to shoot the predator. The incapacity to split is at times highly maladaptive. On the other hand, if all we can do is split, that's also pretty maladaptive. So I'm just trying to say that we have this psychotic area in our minds that we never can entirely get over. It's a part of us. It's psychotic. And this is where religion belongs.